Incredible things can happen when developers decide to step out of their comfort zone and try completely new things that wouldn't normally associate with them. But there's always a lot of risk involved with anything along those lines, because as we've seen more than a few times over the years, it doesn't always work out. In fact, you'll see plenty of examples of that looking just at developers known for making single-player games who end up chasing after multiplayer trends, whether that's at the behest of their publishers or parent companies of their own volition. Of course, results tend to vary from game to game, and for some of them, things do actually turn out quite well. But unfortunately, more often than not, the opposite is the case. Here, that's exactly what we're covering, as we talk about a few times that single-player studios misguidedly ended up chasing multiplayer trends. Anthem. After having built itself up as one of the best Western RPG developers in the industry over the course of decades, with Anthem, BioWare decided to go down the live service looter-shooter route, and it was, well, let's be generous here and say it wasn't great. Anthem was a failure by pretty much every metric, because not only was it sorely lacking in the things that made previous BioWare games as great as they were, it wasn't even a good looter-shooter. Hell, it wasn't even a competent one. It was rife with technical and connectivity issues, missions and objectives were boring, the loot balancing and progression systems were broken, and there was a shocking lack of content, a terrible issue to have for a game that claims to be live service. Of course, it didn't even end up being live service in the end, because after a short period that saw intermittent and underwhelming updates, and some talk of a complete overhaul, BioWare and EA ultimately decided that it just wasn't worth the effort and chose to shut Anthem down. Redfall. Much like BioWare, after climbing to the top of the industry in its respective genre, and staying at the top for quite some time, Arcane took a drastic tumble with its multiplayer experiment. Redfall, having launched earlier this year, is one of the more recent games in this list, and it's also one of the most prominent, because of just how poorly it failed. On top of being a major letdown with its immersive sim elements, which is what Arcane has built its reputation on, Redfall was also broken as a multiplayer experience, with baffling design choices like co-op progress being tied to the host or an internet connection being required even when playing solo, a cavalcade of technical issues, dull and uninspired combat, and a host of other issues dragging the experience down to a level that is, without a shadow of a doubt, the worst game that Arcane has made in a long, long time, if not ever. Marvel's Avengers. When we first learned all those years ago that Crystal Dynamics was making an Avengers game, there was every reason to be excited about how it may turn out. With its track record of numerous single-player action-adventure titles, the studio felt like a perfect fit to take the massive Marvel property and make something unforgettable out of it. Square Enix, however, had other plans, and in all of its infinite wisdom, decided to take a studio known for its single-player games and an IP that was begging to be turned into a single-player narrative-driven experience, and put them together into a live service loot-driven brawler. But now, we all know how it went. Marvel's Avengers, though not without some merits of its own, was underwhelming at best, and from repetitive combat and dull mission designs to an underwhelming story and more, felt like a letdown in a lot of key areas. Crystal Dynamics did, to be fair, support the game for a couple of years after release with the odd expansion and update here and there, but Marvel's Avengers never really came close to touching the heights that we all so desperately had hoped it would. Gotham Knights.
Easy as 1, 2, 3.
Speaking of superhero games that ended up wasting their potential by chasing after multiplayer trends, Gotham Knights is another recent example of a talented single-player studio being let down by misguided behind-the-scenes decisions. Sure, WB Games Montreal was a pretty young team and had only ever developed one game in the past, but given that that one game was the underrated gem Batman Arkham Origins, it's no surprise that the decision to pivot to co-op RPG experience with Gotham Knights was as poorly received as it was. Meaningless and boring loot mechanics, generic progression that did little more than dull the combat's edge, and a multiplayer-focused structure that ended up making sacrifices in areas such as storytelling, Gotham Knights, in spite of being a passably decent, if forgettable time, was not even close to being the kind of game that WB Games Montreal should have moved on to after announcing itself to the world with Arkham Origins. Fallout 76. Fallout 76 is thankfully now a solid example of a game that managed to conjure up a remarkable turnaround in fortunes after an incredibly rough start. But boy, that start was rough. A multiplayer-centric Fallout game is actually a really intriguing idea on paper, unlike many of the other games that we've already spoken about here, but it's fair to say that at launch, 76 was a bit of a disaster. The technical issues that Bethesda Game Studio titles have always been so strongly associated with were out in great force, more so than ever when the game came out in 2018. While in focusing on its multiplayer aspects, many of which felt underbaked and poorly implemented, it also ended up sacrificing much of what makes Fallout Fallout. A total lack of human NPCs and any interesting storytelling, for instance, were chief among them. Happily enough, 5 years on from that troubled launch, with several expansions, smaller DLC releases, and updates under its belt, Fallout 76 is now a genuinely solid experience. Dead Space 3. Dead Space 3 killed one of the greatest survival horror franchises of all time. Yes, the series is now on the road to recovery in the wake of Moto Studios' excellent remake of the original game, but the damage that Dead Space 3 did will never be forgotten. Not just because it destroyed the series, but because it contributed to the eventual closure of Visceral Games. Not only did EA's belief at the time that there were no real market for pure horror games out there lead to a disappointingly action-focused shooter experience, it also led to co-op being shoehorned into the experience. And while Dead Space 3's co-op wasn't totally incapable of delivering enjoyment in small doses, it did completely miss the point in terms of what fans wanted to see from Dead Space games. God of War Ascension. Ascension came out at a time when a great many developers in the industry were cramming in bizarre multiplayer modes into single-player games, like they previously mentioned Dead Space 3. That being the earliest form that the practice of chasing after multiplayer trends took, and like with many of those games, it didn't exactly work out for Ascension. At that time, it already felt like the series was on its last legs thanks to its aging formula, and Ascension proved to be the final nail in that coffin. For a while at least. On top of its largely underwhelming campaign, it also delivered a PvP multiplayer component that just didn't work on any level. Taking the series' brand of action and successfully implementing it into a multiplayer experience was always going to be a tough task, and Ascension's multiplayer didn't really do much to disprove that notion. Metal Gear Survive. After Hideo Kojima's acrimonious departure from Konami, Konami's own decision to pivot away from AAA development, and the gutting of the former Kojima Productions team, it was clear to everyone that Metal Gear was never going to be the same again. Though no one could have predicted things would go as bad as they did with Metal Gear Survive. An utterly soulless, mind-numbingly boring experience that almost felt like an insult to the franchise. Sure, a vast majority of the game's issues were plain to see if you even chose to play it as a purely solo experience, but the addition of co-op didn't really do much to soften the blow of any of its biggest flaws, of which there was no shortage. Resident Evil's many multiplayer attempts. The Resident Evil franchise stubbornly keeps trying to have a breakthrough in the multiplayer space, and though there have been some notable successful attempts in the now distant past with its co-op offerings, from the Outbreak games to Revelations 2 to RE5 when it comes to the PvP side of things, the franchise has, more often than not, suffered unmitigated failures. From Umbrella Corps to Resident Evil Resistance to Resident Evil Reverse, Capcom's beloved survival horror series keeps pumping out abysmal, poorly cobbled together multiplayer experiences. None of these games has done anything to move the needle on that front, and at this point we doubt that they'll ever change. Just make an Outbreak 3, Capcom. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. We'll end things on a slightly different note, because Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is, of course, not out yet. Unlike every other game that we've spoken about here, it's fair to say, however, that based on everything that we've seen of the game so far, it looks like a dead cert for this list when it does release. Not only is it turning an experience with 4 superpowered protagonists into a third-person looter shooter, its implementation of many of those mechanics, as well as ancillary things such as a live service support and what have you, is looking painfully generic. Our hope is that we're proven thoroughly wrong about this one, but as things stand right now, things aren't looking good for Rocksteady's next game. For a developer that was considered to be one of the best single-player studios out there not so long ago, that's hugely disappointing to see. Hey, did you know that we at GamingBolt upload new videos every day? Stick around, drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell, and let us know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future with a comment below.